Excellent. So everyone has a phone, I would assume in this day and age. And I think it really comes back to just the whole idea of documenting. You don't have to have a fancy camera to be taking great photos. Phones have come really a long way. So I just wanted to give everyone three kind of quick and easy tips that you can use just to drastically improve the photos that you're taking with your phone already. So again, maybe you're thinking this is a hobby, you're not sure if you want to get into photography. Start with your phone, see how it goes, and then you can always decide to upgrade and purchase a professional level camera after that. All right, Laura Lee, next slide, please. Perfect. So the first tip I'm going to give you is composition. Composition is key. And this just comes down to the way that we frame up a photograph and the elements we decide we want to keep in the frame, as well as the elements we want to keep out of the frame. So maybe some of those distractions, things that aren't going to look as nice in the background. And composition is going to help us to create stronger, more dynamic photos. At the end of the day, we want people to spend more time looking at our photos. We want people to like our images. And that's all really going to boil down to composition. So the three main things I'm going to cover for composition tonight are avoiding collisions, the rule of thirds, and your viewpoint. So we'll go to next slide, Laura Lee. Perfect. So a collision is something that's distracting in our background. So maybe it's a stop sign, maybe it's a green recycling bin, maybe it's a logo for a business in the background, something that we want to try to keep out of the frame. Another example of a collision is when we position someone in front of a tree and then it looks like they have antlers or there's a tree or a post growing straight out of the top of their head. The other big one that we tend to get in the prairies a lot is the horizon line slicing through someone's head. So even just changing the height, or again, the viewpoint that we're shooting from, can help us to eliminate that type of collision. Rule of thirds, again, my very favorite compositional rule, can really help us to change the photos that we're taking. So we want to avoid having a subject in the center of the frame. So on the right-hand side of this slide, we can see an example of a frame or a viewfinder divided with our third lines. And so the whole idea here is that we can place our subject to the left or to the right, to the top or to the bottom. So in a landscape, how is our photo going to look different if we place our horizon line at that lower line versus the upper line? In a portrait, we want to try to place our subject's eyes along that top third line. And then if we want to really switch things up, we can just try positioning a subject around one of those red circles where the two lines intersect. Perfect. So here's an example of a collision and coming down to changing our viewpoint. So from the image on the left, we can see that horizon line slicing right through their heads. It's kind of hard to unsee once you've seen it in an image versus the photo on the right. We've changed our viewpoint. So by lowering ourselves, we've completely shifted the composition. We've eliminated that collision and we've got a really beautiful portrait. Perfect. So adding a grid on your phone is something that I would recommend doing. You can do this on an iPhone as well as any of the Android phones as well. So if you haven't, I would recommend taking some time just to set that up. All right, so we've got a couple examples of rule of thirds. So on the left here, we can see that we're using kind of an implied horizon line with the tops of the trees for that upper third line because our foreground is very interesting. And then same thing over on the right-hand side, we've got a nice big reflection of the clouds there. We've placed the horizon line towards the upper third of the frame. With portraits, we want to think about whether we're shooting horizontally or vertically, placing our subject's eyes or at least their head towards the top third of the frame, just so that we include a little bit more of their body, a little bit more information about whatever scene we're shooting in. So the two portraits on the outside, we're using the top third rule, and then the one in the middle, we're using the bottom of the table as our rule of thirds. Perfect. So point number two, it's going to be really important to get to know your smartphone if you haven't already. And there's a ton of online resources. So apart from what I'm going to talk you through tonight, just to make sure that you're getting the best that you can out of your phone. So most of us know how to change the focal length or the lens. So we can switch between wide or normal, maybe zoom in with a little bit of a telephoto. And this can be helpful to frame collisions out of the background, shift our composition, and then kind of decide how much we want to include in the frame. Then the second point here is brightness. Happens to me all the time if I'm outside and I maybe want to take a behind the scenes photo on my phone. If it's a really bright sunny day, if I take a normal photo, my subject is kind of in shadow and I can't see their face. So oftentimes I'll use brightness, which we'll see on the next slide in a second, just to bring the exposure up on my phone so that I can get a little bit more detail. Perfect. So again, coming down just to getting to know the settings that we have on various types of phones. We can do next slide, Laura Lee. Perfect. And then adjusting brightness. So on most phones, we're just going to tap the screen and then we have a slider to bring our exposure up or down. So if we have something in shadow, we're going to bring our exposure up. And if we have something that's maybe a little bit too bright, we can bring our exposure down. Okay, and then number 3, my last kind of big takeaway here is editing. If nothing else, we can be better than an Instagram filter. So we'll have a lot more control if we do a little bit of editing on our smartphone. So I would recommend doing some research and finding an app that works for you. My favorite is the Lightroom mobile app. So I use Lightroom when I'm editing photos for clients, and then I use Lightroom on my phone for anything that I'm doing that way. And all of the editing apps that you can access, most of them are going to give us options to kind of change our exposure. So we can make something brighter or darker. We can add contrast. We can change the color. We can crop in a lot of these editing apps as well. We can straighten a horizon line. Let's say you were standing half in a ditch and your photo was crooked. We can correct that horizon line with our editing tool here. So what we want to think about at the bottom of the slide here, so light, how bright or how dark do we want our photo to be? What do we want the colors to look like? Are we going to add an effect? Maybe it's black and white, maybe it's a preset. And then geometry is kind of adjusting our horizon line or maybe correcting for a really wide angle lens. So there's a couple different popular apps, like I mentioned. So Lightroom, and then we'll talk through some others. So this is some screenshots just from Lightroom, kind of walking you through editing a basic photo. So on the very far left, we have our original image. And then as we kind of progress through the different frames in the second column there, we can see our exposure. So we've brightened things up. It came out a little bit dark from the camera. We've added contrast just to give it a little bit more pop to make those colors stand out, make our darker tones a little bit darker. And then we pulled the highlights down a little bit so we could see some more detail in the Let's Party sign on the background there. Our third panel is adjusting our white balance. So if we want to make things look warmer or cooler, and then we are adjusting it just because, again, the photo came out a little bit crooked from the camera. So we're correcting that at the end. If you're like me, you probably hold your head a little bit towards the left. And so I find when I'm shooting, most of my things come out a little bit crooked and I've always got to fix them at the end. Perfect. So again, just kind of running us through some apps. I've got a couple of different examples here. On the left for every single one is the original photo, the way that it was taken in the camera, and then on the right is the edited version. So we've got the Lightroom mobile option here. Snapseed is another really great one. It has a lot of different kind of presets built into it, so you can get a lot of different effects. And then on the next slide, we've got Visco, VSCO, however you want to pronounce it. Same thing. So just another example of really finding a subject that was maybe a little bit too dark, a little bit underexposed, and we can brighten it back up with a little bit of our editing software here. And then photo editor is another good option there as well. So we're not doing anything crazy to any of these photos, but we're definitely improving them from what they looked like just straight out of the phone. Perfect. Get out there and practice. The best way to learn is to shoot and improve and just try new techniques.